Good morning. We're reading The Five People You Meet in Heaven. There you go. By Mitch Albom. And I have it upside down. There you go. It's exciting, huh? Um, so we are just ready to meet the fourth person. And the fourth person that Eddie meets is his wife, Marguerite. And he meets her. She's chosen all these different weddings because that's where her place in heaven is, where people have not realized that they still think that life is good and all these great things can happen because evidently she has had disappointments. And I'm sure one of those was not being able to have children. Eddie blinked and found himself in a small, round room. The mountains were gone, and so was the jade sky. A low plaster ceiling just missed his head. The room was brown, as plain as shipping wrap, and empty except for a wooden stool and an oval mirror on the wall. Eddie stepped in front of the mirror. He cast no reflection. He saw. I thought I read this maybe. Oh, I lied. I've read that. Man, I'm going to have to start. Sorry. This is a rough beginning when it's live. All right. Love like rain can nourish from above. He's still dealing with this fourth person, okay? And he just had the Leicester Street overpass was where his wife was hit. Or they dropped a bottle on her when she was going to get him on his birthday from the racetrack. He's not had good birthdays because that's also when his dad was put in the hospital. Love like rain can nourish from above, drenching couples with a soaking joy, but sometimes under the angry heat of life, love dries on the surface and it must nourish from below, tending to its roots, keeping itself alive. The accident on Leicester Street sent Marguerite to the hospital. She was confined to bed rest for nearly 6 months. Her injured liver recovered eventually, but the expense and the delay cost them their adoption. The child they were expecting went to someone else, and the unspoken blame for this never found a resting place. It simply moved like a shadow from husband to wife. Marguerite went quiet for a long time, and Eddie lost himself in work. The shadow took a place at their table, and they ate in its presence and the lonely clanking of forks and plates. And when they spoke of small things. The water of their love discussed much over breakfast that didn't feel like an effort. An amusement park in California introduced the first tubular steel tracks. They twisted at severe angles, unachievable with wood, and suddenly roller coasters, which had faded to near oblivion, were back in fashion. Mr. Bullock, the park owner, had ordered a steel track for Ruby Pier, and Eddie oversaw the construction. He barked at the installers. He checked their every move. He didn't trust anything this fast. 60-degree angles? I mean, he was sure someone would get hurt. Anyhow, it gave him a distraction. The Stardust band shell was torn down, so was the zipper ride, the tunnel of love, which kids found too corny now. A few years later, a new boat ride called a log flume was constructed, and to Eddie's surprise, it was hugely popular. The riders floated through tough troughs of water and dropped at the end into a large splash pool. Eddie could not figure out why people so loved getting wet when the ocean was just 300 yards away. But he maintained it just the same, working shoeless in the water, ensuring that the boats never loosened from the tracks. In time, husband and wife began talking again, and one night Eddie even spoke about adopting, and Marguerite rubbed her forehead and said, "We're too old now." Eddie said, "What's too old to a child?" Same question she asked, right? The years passed, and while child never came, their wound slowly healed, and their companionship rose to fill the space they were saving for another. In the mornings, she made him toast and coffee, and he dropped her at her cleaning job and then drove back to the pier. Sometimes in the afternoon, she got off early and walked the boardwalk with him, following his rounds, riding carousel horses or yellow painted clamshells as Eddie explained the rotors and the cables and listened for the engine's hum. One July evening, they found themselves walking by the ocean, eating grape popsicles, their bare feet sinking in the wet sand. They looked around and realized that they were the oldest people on the beach. Marguerite said something about the bikini bathing suit the young girls were wearing and how she would never have the nerve to wear such a thing. Eddie said the girls were lucky because if she did, the men would not look at anyone else. And even by this point, Marguerite was in her mid-40s and her hips had thickened and a web of small lines had formed around her eyes. She thanked Eddie gratefully and looked at his crooked nose and wide jaw. The waters of their love fell again from above and soaked them as surely as the sea that gathered at their feet. 3 years later, she was breading chicken cutlets in the kitchen of their apartment, the one they had kept all this time, long after Eddie's mother had died, because Marguerite said it reminded her of when they were kids, and she liked to see the old carousel out the window. And suddenly, without warning, the fingers of her right hand stretched open uncontrollably. They moved backward. They would not close. The cutlet slid from her palm. It fell into the sink, and her arm throbbed. Her breathing thickened. She stared for a moment at this hand with the locked fingers that appeared to belong to someone else, someone gripping a large, invisible jar, and then everything went dizzy. "Eddie," she called, but by the time he arrived, she had passed out on the floor. It was, they would determine, a tumor on the brain, and her decline would be like many others, treatments that made the disease seem mild, hair falling out in patches, mornings spent with noisy radiation machines, and evenings spent vomiting in a hospital toilet. In the final days, when cancer was ruled the victor, the doctors said only, "Rest. Take it easy." When she asked questions, they nodded sympathetically as if their nods were medicine doled with a dropper. She realized this was protocol, their way of being nice while being helpless. And when one of them suggested getting your affairs in order, she asked to be released from the hospital, and she told more than asked. Eddie helped her up the stairs and hung her coat as she looked around the apartment. She wanted to cook, but he made her sit. He heated some water for tea. He had purchased lamb chops the day before, and that night he bumbled through a dinner with several invited friends and coworkers, most of whom greeted Marguerite and her sallow complexion with sentences like, "Well, look who's back," as if this were a homecoming and not a farewell party. They ate mashed potatoes from a Corningware dish and hot butterscotch brownies for dessert. And when Marguerite finished a second glass of wine, Eddie took the bottle and poured her a third. 2 days later, she awoke with a scream. He drove her to the hospital in the pre-dawn silence. They spoke in short sentences what doctor might be on, who Eddie should call, and even though she was sitting in the seat next to him, Eddie felt her in everything. He felt her in the steering wheel, in the gas pedal, in the blinking of his eye, in the clearing of his throat. Every move he made was about hanging on to her. She was 47 years old. "You have the card?" she asked him. "The card," he said blankly. She drew a deep breath, closed her eyes. Her voice was thinner than when she resumed speaking, as if that breath had cost her deeply. "Insurance," she croaked. Yeah, he said quickly. "I got the card." And they parked in the lot, and Eddie shut the engine. It was suddenly too still, too quiet. He heard every tiny sound, the squeak of his body on the leather seat, the clunk of the door handle, the rush of outside air, his feet on the pavement, the jangle of his keys. He opened her door and helped her to get out. Her shoulders were scrunched up near her jaws like a freezing child. Her hair blew across her face. She sniffed and lifted her eyes to the horizon. She motioned to Eddie and nodded toward the distant top of a big white amusement ride with red carts dangling like tree ornaments. "You can see it from here," she said. "The Ferris wheel," he said. She looked away. Home. Because he had not slept in heaven. It was Eddie's perception that he had not spent more than a few hours with any of the people that he'd met. Then again, without night or day, without sleeping or waking, without sunsets or high tides or meals or schedules, how did he know how long it was? With Marguerite, he wanted only time, more and more time, and he was granted it. Night times, daytimes, and night times again. And they walked through the doors of the assorted weddings and spoke of everything he wished to speak about. At a Swedish ceremony, Eddie told her about his brother Joe, who had died 10 years earlier from a heart attack just a month after purchasing a new condo in Florida. At a Russian ceremony, she asked if he had kept the old apartment, and he'd said that he had, and she said she was glad. At an outdoor ceremony in a Lebanese village, he spoke about what had happened to him here in heaven, and she seemed to listen and know at the same time. He spoke of the blue man and his story, and why some die when others live. And he spoke about the captain and his tale of sacrifice. And when he spoke about his father, Marguerite recalled the many nights he had spent enraged at the man, confounded by his silence. Eddie told her he had many things. Square, and her eyebrows lifted and his lips spread, and Eddie felt an old warm feeling that he had missed for years, the simple act of making his wife happy. One night, Eddie spoke about the changes at Ruby Pier, how the old rides had been torn down, and how the penny whistle music at the arcade was now blaring rock and roll, and how the roller coasters now had corkscrew twists and carts that hung down from the tracks, how the dark rides, which once meant cowboy cutouts and glow paint, were full of video screens now, like watching TV all the time. He told her the new names, no more dippers or tumblebugs. Everything was the Blizzard, the Mind Bender, the Top Gun, the Vortex. "Sounds strange, don't it?" Eddie said. "It sounds," she said wistfully, "like someone else's summer." And Eddie realized that was precisely what he'd been feeling for years. "I should have worked somewhere else," he told her. I'm sorry I never got us out of there. My dad, my leg, I always felt like such a bum after the war. He saw sadness pass over her face. What happened, she asked, during that war? He'd never quite told her. It was all understood. Soldiers in his day did what they had to do, and they didn't speak of it once they came home. He thought about the men that he had killed, and he thought about the guards, and he thought about the blood on his hands, and he wondered if he'd ever be forgiven. I lost myself, he said. No, his wife said. Yes, he whispered, and she said nothing else. At times there in heaven, the two of them would lie down together, but they did not sleep. On earth, Marguerite said, when you fall asleep, you sometimes dream your heaven, and those dreams help to form it. But there was no reason for such dreams now. Instead, Eddie just held her shoulders and nuzzled in her hair and took long, deep breaths. At one point, he asked his wife if God knew he was here, and she smiled and said, of course. And even when Eddie admitted that some of his life he'd spent hiding from God, and the rest of the time he thought he went unnoticed. The fourth lesson. Finally, after many talks, Marguerite walked Eddie through another door, and they were back inside the small round room. She sat on the stool and placed her fingers together. She turned to the mirror, and Eddie noticed her reflection. Hers, but not his. The bride waits here, she said, running her hands along her hair, taking in her image but seeming to drift away. This is the moment you think about what you're doing, who you're choosing, who you will love, and if it's right, Eddie, this can be such a wonderful moment. She turned to him. You had to live without love for many years, didn't you? Eddie said nothing. You felt that it was snatched away, that I left you too soon. He lowered himself slowly. Her lavender dress was spread before him. You did leave too soon, he said. You were angry with me. No. Her eyes flashed. Okay, yes. There was a reason to it all, she said. What reason, he said. How could there be a reason? You died. You were 47. You were the best person any of us knew. And you died, and you lost everything. And I lost everything. I lost the only woman I ever loved. She took his hands. No, you didn't. I was right here, and you loved me anyway. Lost love is still love, Eddie. It takes a different form. That's all. You can't see their smile, or bring them food, or tussle their hair, or move them around a dance floor. But when those senses weaken, another heightens. Memory. Memory becomes your partner, and you nurture it, you hold it, you dance with it. Life has to end, she said, but love does not. Eddie thought about the years after he buried his wife. It was like looking over a fence. He was aware of another kind of life out there, even as he knew he would never be a part of it. I never wanted anyone else, he said quietly. I know, she said. I was still in love with you. I know, she nodded. I felt it. Here, he asked. Even here, she said, smiling. That's how strong lost love can be. She stood and opened a door, and Eddie blinked as he entered behind her. It was a dimly lit room with foldable chairs and an accordion player sitting in the corner. I was saving this one, she said. She held out her arms, and for the first time in heaven, he initiated his contact. He came to her, ignoring the leg, ignoring all the ugly associations he had made about dance and music and weddings, realizing now that those were really about loneliness. All that's missing, Marguerite whispered, taking his shoulder, is the bingo cards. He grinned, and he put a hand behind her waist. Can I ask you something, he said. Yes. How come you look the way that you looked the day I married you? I thought you'd like it that way. He thought for a moment. Can you change it? Change it? She looked amused. To what? To the end. She lowered her arms. I wasn't so pretty at the end. Eddie shook his head as if to say, not true. Could you? And she took a moment, and then she came again into his arms, and the accordion man played the familiar notes, and she hummed in his ear, and they began to move together slowly in a remembered rhythm that a husband shares only with his wife. You made me love you. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it. When he moved his head back, she was 47 again. The web of lines beside her eyes, the thinner hair, the looser skin beneath her chin, and she smiled, and he smiled, and she was to him as beautiful as ever. And he closed his eyes, and he said for the first time what he'd been feeling from the moment he saw her again. I don't want to go on. I just want to stay here. And when he opened his eyes, his arms still held her shape, but she was gone, and so was everything else. He emerged with a stack of envelopes. taken from a kitchen drawer, some from a local bank, some from the Veterans Administration. I skipped a page. I'm really a mess today. Dominguez pressed the elevator button, and the door rumbled closed. An inner porthole lined up with an exterior porthole, and the car jerked forward upward, and through the meshed glass he watched the lobby disappear. I can't believe this elevator still works, Dominguez said. It must be like from the last century. The man beside him, an estate attorney, nodded slightly, feigning interest. He took off his hat. It was stuffy. He was sweating, and he watched the numbers light up on the brass panel. This was his third appointment of the day. One more, and he could go home to dinner. Eddie didn't have much, Dominguez said. Uh-huh, the man said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. Then it shouldn't take long. The elevator bounced to a stop. The door rumbled open. They turned toward 6B. The hallway still had the black and white checkered tile of the 1960s, and it smelled of someone's cooking, garlic and fried potatoes. The superintendent had given them a key along with a deadline. Next Wednesday, have the place cleared out for a new tenant. Wow, Dominguez said, upon opening the door and entering the kitchen. Pretty tidy for an old man. The sink was clean. The counters were wiped. Lord knows he thought his place was never this neat. Financial papers, the man asked. Bank statements, jewelry. Dominguez thought of Eddie wearing jewelry. He almost laughed. He realized how much he missed the old man, how strange it was not having him at the pier, barking orders and watching everything like a mother hawk. They hadn't even cleared out his locker. No one had the heart. They just left his stuff at the shop where it was, as if he were going to come back tomorrow. I don't know. You checking that bedroom thing? The bureau? Yeah, I only been here once myself. I really only knew Eddie through work. Dominguez leaned over the table, glanced out of the kitchen window, and he saw the old carousel. He looked at his watch. Speaking of work, he thought to himself. The attorney opened the top drawer of the bedroom bureau. He pushed aside the pair of socks, neatly rolled one inside the other, and the underwear, white boxer shorts stacked by the waistbands. Tucked beneath them was an old leather-bound box, a serious-looking thing, and he flipped it open in hopes of a quick find. And he frowned. There was nothing important. No bank statements, no insurance policies, just a black bow tie, a Chinese restaurant menu, an old deck of cards, a letter with an army medal, and a faded Polaroid of a man by a birthday cake surrounded by children. Hey, Dominguez called from the other room. Is this what you need? And he emerged with a stack of envelopes taken from a kitchen drawer, some from a local bank, some from the Veterans Administration, and the attorney fingered through them, and without looking up, he said, that'll do. And he pulled out one bank statement and made a mental note of the balance. And then, as often happened at these visits, he silently congratulated himself on his own portfolio of stocks, bonds, and a vested retirement plan. It sure beat ending up like this, poor slob, with little to show but a tidy kitchen. And that's the end of that. We will see you tomorrow. I do love you, and you are very special. Tomorrow, we finish the book. Have a great day.